everybody, welcome back to Coach All Writes. In today's video, we're going to be talking about common mistakes that students make on AP Lang synthesis essays. Before we get started, let's be sure to stay in touch. Make sure that you subscribe and turn those notifications on. That way you don't miss any upcoming AP Lang content. Also, be sure to check out the description box below for some useful links. This first mistake is arguably the most severe mistake that a student can make on an AP Lang synthesis essay, and that is not using three sources. I've seen it happen where a student wrote a pretty decent essay, but they only had two sources, not three. And so because of that, they could only earn a score of a 1 out of 4 in row B. So here are a couple quick fixes to avoid this happening. Quick fix number 1 is going to be to plan your main ideas and which sources you will use before you write. I encourage my students to make a pretty simple outline before they actually start their essay. So they'll put their thesis, main idea 1, and they'll say what main idea 1 is. Then underneath that, they'll put the sources they intend to use. Some students do a little bit more. They might put their evidence and commentary, but on the exam, you don't have a ton of time. Then they'll do main idea 2, and they'll put the sources they intend to use for that one. This allows them to make sure that they have 3 total sources, and it becomes a bit of a checklist. Double check that you have 3 sources before moving on to your next essay on the AP Lang exam, or if it's an in-class assignment, make sure that you double check that you've included 3 sources before you turn your assignment in. Quick fix number 2 is going to be for a situation where you realize that time is running out and you've only got 2 sources so far. So here's what you can do. While it might not be the best solution, you can squeeze in another source. I've seen students do this where they added it to their intro. Maybe they used a source that defined what the topic was, or I've even seen students include a source in their conclusion. Now, of course, the execution of this matters. Preferably, you're not just going to haphazardly drop in a source. But technically, this could be a way to get that third source in if the clock is ticking and you have like next to no time left. So quick fix number 2 is more of a fail-safe strategy if you are legitimately out of time and you got to squeeze in that third source. Probably the most common mistake that I see students making on their AP Lang synthesis essays is limited commentary. So many of the essays that score a 1-2-0, they just simply need more developed commentary. Their thesis is fine. They have decent main ideas. They've selected appropriate evidence. It's just that the commentary is not driving the essay forward to break into those upper scores on the rubric. So here are some quick tips for you. Ask yourself why, how, or so what. So think about it this way. Why did I choose this evidence? What does it show? Now you want to use a different word besides shows if possible. So you could do demonstrates, underscores, illustrates, highlights. There are several other verbs you could use. You can also add a because clause because when you say the word because, you're adding on why. And commentary is essentially why. It's why the evidence is significant and how it proves your thesis. Sometimes those students add a because clause and it's still a little bit superficial. So sometimes you almost need to do a double because, meaning you need to keep asking yourself why and developing that commentary more. So if you add the word because, you want to make sure that your answer after that is detailed and specific. Be thorough. And encourage yourself to think big picture too. Like, why is this actually important? It also helps if you include linking language. This could be words like consequently, thus, therefore. Those words help you transition between your ideas and can help you potentially develop your commentary more. They also help with effective transitions, which can sometimes help your line of reasoning. Another common mistake that I see students making is improper citations. On the AP Lang exam, students can cite using the author's last name or the source letter. So like source A. In my experience, most students do the latter. And for me as a teacher, I teach my students to do the source letter. And that's simply because for me, that's how I remember the sources. And so it's easier for me to grade when students say source A as opposed to the author's last name. Now, when you're in college, you're going to use the author's last name for MLA or APA citations. So it's good to know both methods. The source letter thing is just personally my preference. Whichever method you choose, though, you want to be consistent. At the AP reading, in my experience, Readers are typically encouraged to count the source if it is clear which source the student is referring to, even if there isn't a citation. Now, personally, I would not leave this to chance. I would double check that I had not only three sources, but that all of my evidence had a proper citation. I can tell you as a teacher and a reader, it is really frustrating when students don't cite their evidence because then I have to go back and figure out which source it came from. And then on top of that, I have to figure out, was it a third source or was it the same as their first or second source? Because that means I'm trying to figure out if the student has three sources, since that affects their evidence and commentary score. Now, while I will do this, I will go back and check and see if I can figure out which source the student is talking about. It is a little bit frustrating, I'm not going to lie. And that problem can be solved by you, the student, including a proper citation in the first place. So please make sure that you are citing your evidence. If you need help with your citations, I do have two different videos about synthesis citations. One is admittedly shorter, whereas the other one is longer and more detailed. I'll include links to both of them in the description box below. That way you can choose which video is more useful to you. Also, as an added tip, I personally encourage my students to avoid saying according to source A. This does count as a citation and it's better than nothing, but personally, I like to have them use the original source material. So let's say that the original source was a research study from Pew Research in 2017. Instead of saying according to source A, I would have them say according to a 2017 Pew Research study. I personally feel like that sounds better. It's a way to weave in the evidence more naturally and more smoothly. It's also less jarring to the reader because it's giving credit to where the source came from. Therefore, it's helping to explain why you would include that evidence. In some sense, it adds credibility to the source. So you could state where the source came from, the author's name. There's different ways to do it. I go over this more in those videos that I mentioned. But then when you're done with that sentence, at the end, you can include a parenthetical citation. That's when you would put source A in parentheses and the period would go outside the parentheses. Another common mistake on AP Lang synthesis essays is when students summarize the sources rather than actually analyzing. So it's okay to give a bit of context to introduce the evidence. Doing so helps the evidence seem less jarring. But at the same time, we want to avoid summarizing the sources because summary is not analysis. So please don't write your whole essay saying source A says this and then giving us a summary, and then source B says this and then another summary. Your job is not to tell us what the sources say, but rather your job is to use evidence from the sources to support your argument. We want your voice to shine through. So instead of telling what the source is about, you want to explain how the quote you've chosen proves your thesis. So less summary, more analysis. Another common mistake is underdeveloped broader context. I tend to see this for students who are trying to earn the sophistication point. And so I'm glad to see students attempting it, but let me tell you how to fix it. Broader context is when you include information beyond what is provided in the sources. This can include personal experience, historical knowledge, just general outside knowledge. So for example, for the historical preservation prompt, which was one of the prompts from 2024, simply mentioning historical locations is not enough. So for instance, if students said something like historical places like the Alamo or the Eiffel Tower, just name dropping those places is not broader context. However, if a student were to select a historical site that connects to the main idea they're trying to prove and analyze the value of this place by providing details, that could potentially be broader context. So for example, one of the sources in that packet brought up the idea that some people are in favor of modernizing historical buildings, especially historical homes, like for instance, adding solar panels. But then those who are opposed to it feel like it's ruining the aesthetic. So let's say that your town has a historical building, like maybe there's a historic downtown in your area. You could potentially tell an anecdote about that, depending on which side you're on, talking about how, no, it doesn't ruin the aesthetic. You can keep the charm on the outside and have modern interior. Or if you're on the opposite side, you could talk about, yeah, it totally does ruin the aesthetic, and here's why. Here's what it looked like, and that kind of thing. So, by providing those extra details and connecting some outside knowledge to what the source says, you can develop that broader context. Another example that some of my students like to use is when we cover the library synthesis prompt. There is one source in there that is essentially a library schedule, and it talks about different classes offered at the library. Now, in my opinion, there's plenty to say about that source alone, but some of my students like to connect that source to their own experience in a library. So they talk about their experience with the different library programs during the summer. And by going into detail and explaining its significance, they're going beyond the source. And so, if executed well and consistently, it can potentially lead to broader context. So, the way to avoid this common mistake is to really develop your broader context, add in specific details, and make sure it's clear why you're including that outside information rather than just name dropping. Another common mistake is a lack of conversation. So, you might have heard of a synthesis essay being called a conversation of sources. If you think about a conversation, there are at least two voices. A good conversation isn't one-sided. And so, in a synthesis essay, in my opinion at least, if an essay has 3 body paragraphs, each of the body paragraphs has only one source. The essay can feel more like a summary than an argument, and oftentimes the paragraphs can seem disjointed. The essay can have a weak line of reasoning. One way to fix this would be to include 2 sources in at least one body paragraph. These 2 sources can agree, disagree, or just simply highlight different perspectives of the main idea of the paragraph. By including 2 voices in a body paragraph, it's starting that conversation. You can continue the conversation by having strong transitions between your paragraphs. It also helps if you think about which main idea should be first versus second. I've heard it termed an irreversible line of reasoning, meaning there should be a reason why your first body paragraph has the main idea that it does, and the same for the second and third, if you have a third. Thinking about the order of your body paragraphs can also help that conversation because, like I said, it helps with those transitions. When you include 2 sources in one of your body paragraphs, be sure to use linking language, whether it's similarly or conversely, or other types of transitional phrases to help smooth out that conversation. All right, there you have it. Those are the most common mistakes that I have seen in AP Lang synthesis essays. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And also, don't forget to subscribe. That way you don't miss any upcoming videos as you are preparing for the AP Lang exam. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy writing!